Imagine that you have a printing press at home that can print money, and there is a law that requires the money that you print to be accepted by every person and every business in the country. You could buy multi-million-dollar mansions, the most expensive luxury cars, top-of-the-line clothes, Rolex watches, yachts, private jets, and the best of fine artwork, all without limit and beyond your wildest dreams. You could become a famous philanthropist creating programs to help the poor, the unemployed, and the elderly. Let that sink in for a minute and explain to me how you would go trillions of dollars into debt. You wouldn't. Why would the thought borrowing money ever cross your mind? If a group of prominent bankers came to you and said, "In spite of your good deeds, popular opinion is building. People fear the unregulated printing of money. We are the country's top economists, and if you give us your printing press, we will give our official endorsement, provide the illusion of constraint, and gladly lend you any amount of money that you want at a very low interest rate which, by the way, you never have to repay." Really? Would you trust them? But that is exactly what we have now. The government can print United States notes and spend them, which was last done in 1963, but it cannot legally print Federal Reserve notes and spend them. The Federal Reserve is a private corporation, a government-sponsored enterprise, and Federal Reserve notes are private corporate banknotes. The Fed effectively owns the printing press and can print or otherwise create any amount of money totally independent of any congressional approval or oversight. And in order for the government to borrow more money for its budgetary con game, it borrows the money from the Federal Reserve. The Fed purchases government treasury bills, treasury notes, and treasury bonds in exchange for its newly created money and then sells the securities on the open market at a huge profit. And all of us are stuck with the perpetual interest payments through ever-increasing taxes plus the hidden tax of inflation. Printing United States notes and spending them without debt is, however, not a good alternative. It would still cause inflation, which not only hides the real tax rate, but also discourages saving and has a destabilizing effect on the economy. In the beginning, the Federal Reserve actually had a positive stated objective: to prevent runs on banks that got themselves in financial trouble and to even out the business cycle. From that noble beginning about 100 years ago, the Fed morphed into the entity of absolute power that we have today. To understand the process, we need to look at banking before the Federal Reserve. From the beginning, a bank was considered a safe place to keep one's money. But there was one big difference: the gold standard. The government did not print money, it minted gold and silver coins, as the Constitution still requires, by the way. The paper money that existed at the time was printed by each individual bank as a receipt, a banknote, for the gold and silver deposited with the bank. Customers were charged a small fee for a safe place to keep their money. These notes were easier to carry, easier to hide, and often exchanged for goods and services instead of the actual gold or silver. The banknotes were considered just as valuable as the actual gold or silver because a bank's success depended on its spotless reputation. If somehow there was an occasion where everyone wanted to take their money out of the bank at the same time, how could that possibly cause a problem for depositors? Well, imagine that you were a banker back then. Hundreds of customers have gold in your vault. Also, a loan broker, you offer to split the interest received on any gold that customers make available to lend with the interest rate determined by the supply of money made available and the demand for loans. All is well, but then you notice all of that gold just sitting idly in the vault day after day, and then you get a brilliant idea. If you lend Joe's gold and don't tell him, you get to keep all of the interest income for yourself. If Joe comes in for his gold, you can use Paul's gold to cover it. If you don't get too greedy, you could actually get away with it. Couldn't you? Ah, but there was one big problem that made that very difficult. The banker would lend the gold, the borrower would spend it, and whoever received the gold would likely put it back in the bank. The banker would issue a fresh banknote for the newly received deposit, but would have no way of knowing that this was the same gold that he had just lent. With the compounding effect of several of these inflationary cycles, the banker would conclude that his business was expanding and that he could take more risk. Also, with this newly created money, the town would experience an economic boom. However, all artificial booms eventually end, and the resulting downturn in the economy would make people nervous and want the security of real gold, often triggering a run on the bank. With banknotes issued well in excess of deposits, the bank would fail and many people would lose all of their money. Instead of passing laws against the misappropriation of depositors' funds and the making of fraudulent loans, the individual state governments, completely ignoring the compounding effect, passed laws to regulate the process by enforcing a reserve requirement, a percentage of the deposits that could not be lent. But, because of either incompetence or corruption, the reserve requirement averaged a very low 15%. This is the origin of the fractional reserve system, legalized fraud, which is the foundation of our present banking system. As a result, there were many boom and bust cycles accompanied by bank failures that were falsely blamed on the business cycle. The Federal Reserve to the rescue. To put an end to bank failures, the Fed was given the power to create money and make loans to banks to make up for the shortfall if too many customers wanted to withdraw their money at the same time. They called it providing liquidity. Since the Federal Reserve was considered part of the United States government, runs on the banks were prevented by giving depositors a false sense of security in the banking system. Both the Federal Reserve Act and, by no coincidence in my opinion, the 16th Amendment were passed in the same year, 1913. The Federal Reserve Act established a central bank to make loans not only to banks, but especially to the federal government, and the 16th Amendment, authorizing a federal income tax, provided the collateral for those government loans. The full faith and credit of the U.S. taxpayer, enforced by the absolute power of the IRS, guaranteed the loans. However, with the gold standard, the amount of banknotes circulating in excess of the gold deposits could only go so far. If the reserve requirement was 15%, the amount of banknotes could only increase to about 6 times the amount of gold deposited. The bankers' profits and the resulting inflation would end. This is an absolute mathematical limit, unless the gold standard could be eliminated. With the availability of money and interest rates under the complete control of the Federal Reserve, immediately in 1914, the roller coaster ride got underway. Government borrowing from the Fed starting in 1914 to finance World War I increased the money supply 70%, causing inflation. In early 1920, the discount interest rate was raised from 1.25% to 6% to fight the inflation. The money supply went down only 11%, but unemployment increased to 20%. In 1924, the discount interest rate was lowered from 6% to 3% to fight the unemployment. This, along with an easy money policy, caused the Roaring '20s stock market boom. People would buy stocks, the value of the stocks would increase, they would present the stocks as collateral, then the bankers would loan them more money to buy more stocks and repeat the process. The money supply increased 60%, and the unemployment rate went down to 5%. In 1928, to fight the inflationary boom, the discount rate was increased from 3% to 5%, followed by tight money policies in 1929. That led to the October 29, 1929 stock market crash. The money supply decreased 35%, and unemployment increased to 24%. The resulting Great Depression made possible the New Deal entitlement expansion of government and permanently changed its charter from very limited to totally unlimited. How about that for stabilizing the business cycle? The Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve were the top bankers of the time. Were they that incompetent? They failed miserably. Or did they? There was one huge gain for the Federal Reserve that I would like to point out. At the bottom of the Great Depression in 1934, gold was made illegal for the public to own. I fail to understand the rationale, but a law was passed requiring people to take their gold coins to the bank and exchange them for Federal Reserve notes. People were confused and desperate enough to comply. The Federal Reserve, a private corporation, took possession of virtually all of the gold in circulation in the United States at that time. This fact is briefly mentioned in history books, but it is not reported that it was, and still is, the biggest gold heist in the history of the human race, and it was the first big step in completely eliminating the gold standard. Where is the gold now? Well, we may never know. When the Federal Reserve Act was passed in 1913, the law made the Fed exempt from federal, state, and local taxes in spite of an enormous profit potential, and also exempt from audit. Are you getting the sense that there was some chicanery involved here? In 1974, President Nixon ended the gold standard and the rest of the world soon followed. Without a gold-backed currency, the Fed and central banks in every other country in the world could create any amount of money without limit, reducing the value of the currency for everyone in the process. Also, With a New Deal entitlement policy, an income tax, and no real debt limit, the federal government was able to grow to an unimaginable level, destroying the middle class, increasing poverty and homelessness, regulating almost every aspect of human action, eliminating the right to privacy, flexing its military muscle, creating enemies all over the world, and obligating children to more than a $50,000 debt as soon as they are born, rendering the Pledge of Allegiance totally obscene. The 16th Amendment not only resulted in greatly increased taxes, but also had a huge indirect effect: outsourcing. For the first 130 years of this country, most of the federal revenue was from tariffs, which averaged around 20%. A tariff is a tax on foreign products sold here. The tax on domestic production, mainly through state and local taxes, was lower, about 10%. With domestic production encouraged in an environment of freedom, a frontier settlement was able to grow to become the richest country in the world and a major exporter of its high-quality products. It could be argued that, to be fair, tariffs and taxes should have been made equal, but that is not what happened. Now, with domestic business and labor taxed at 35% and tariffs down to 1.3%, the tax structure is totally reversed. As a result, it is much cheaper to manufacture in foreign countries, especially for large quantity production, because of lower labor cost, lower taxes, much less regulation, and virtually no tariffs. The American worker and American entrepreneur cannot compete with this totally unfair form of globalization. This is free trade for them, but we have to pay through the nose to manufacture and sell the same products in our own country. In addition, with an unlimited amount of money made available for loans and with savings steadily devalued by inflation, one who wants to save money to buy a house, car, or industrial equipment, as used to be the norm, is now at a total disadvantage compared to one who borrows the money and makes the payments. As a result, the entire economy runs on debt. People are given the illusion of ownership of high-ticket items only if the banker makes the loan and gets his cut. And, due to the long-term effects of inflation, saving for retirement is only possible by investing the money saved, which puts it at risk and allows Wall Street and the bankers to determine how much you will win or how much you will lose. That gets us to the absurd economy that we have now. The Federal Reserve effectively owns the printing press, prints money, and makes a huge tax-free profit for every dollar that they print, which includes the $17 trillion in national debt, interest on all of the money lent since 1913, plus all of the other money created and lent into circulation here and all over the world. Without an independent audit, the exact total can only be estimated to be at least $30 trillion. That is $300 billion per year, on the average, each year for past 100 years. With that level of pilfering, the loss of high-volume manufacturing jobs, multiple boom and bust cycles, high public and private debt, high taxes, high inflation, and a balance of trade deficit for the past 40 years, no economy could be expected to do well. It's a miracle that it has made it this far without total collapse. The middle class has been completely destroyed. Up to 1972, the income distribution was a bell curve, a natural distribution showing a strong middle class with a minority of poor and few rich. But slowly since then, the middle class has disappeared. The income distribution, even in 2005, at the peak of the real estate boom, before the 2008 crash, is nothing like a bell curve. It shows more households at or near the poverty level than any other income level. Homelessness, once rare, is now commonplace. With government spending dominating the economy, the connected minority get richer with government jobs, government contracts, or government bailouts, while the middle class is being pushed closer and closer to the poverty level. The empire of the United States was conquered without a shot being fired and is still being vigorously plundered. Abraham Lincoln once said, "All the armies of Europe, Asia, and Africa combined, with all the treasure of the earth, our own excepted, in their military chest, with a Bonaparte for a commander, could not by force take a drink from the Ohio or make a track on the Blue Ridge in a trial of 1,000 years." At what point then is the approach of danger to be expected? I answer, if it ever reach us, it must spring up among us. It cannot come from abroad. If destruction be our lot, we must ourselves be its author and finisher. As a nation of free men, we must live through all time, or die by suicide. How do we die by suicide as a nation? Are we all that apathetic? Unaware? Well, it is difficult to be otherwise with the entitlement culture is so well established and with the media bombarding us with headline rhetoric and misdirection. This is the richest country in the world. This is a democracy. Your vote counts. Support our troops who fight the unending battles for your freedom. Every other country is worse off. If you just work harder, you can still achieve the American dream. Cuts in social programs would spell disaster. Income equality tax the rich. The problem is corporate greed. Automation, illegal immigration, the minimum wage, the Chinese, the Republicans, the Democrats, the Tea Party. The media is biased and has control of the narrative, but the internet can counter the popular media. To put an end to this insidious form of economic enslavement here, and in virtually every other country in the world, the artificial economy of the central bankers, by the central bankers, and for the central bankers must be replaced by a natural economy. Since the central bankers have acquired most of the gold, this must be done without gold or gold backing and can actually be done without backing by any commodity and without totally disrupting the present banking system. Find out how at theethicaleconomy.com. Please spread the word.